and sisters of Africa, children of the Sahel, and all those watching across the globe. I greet you with the strength of our ancestors and the resolve of our forefathers. Today, I speak not just as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a humble son of Africa, witness to her pain, her struggle, and now her awakening. For far too long, the nations of the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, walked paths that were designed for us by others, paths that led us deeper into debt, into dependence, into division. And each time we tried to rise, our wings were clipped not by our own people, but by the very institutions that claim to protect freedom and peace.
Controversy that has sparked intense debate across the African continent. It concerns the long-standing financial agreements between several African countries and the Central Bank of France. Critics are calling it a system that perpetuates economic dependence and inequality.
For over half a century, a quiet but powerful economic mechanism has shaped the destinies of numerous African nations, often in ways many of their citizens are only just beginning to understand. It's a financial arrangement with colonial roots, involving 14 African countries and the French Central Bank, that has triggered growing outrage, heated debate, and strong calls for reform. At the center of this debate lies a simple yet jarring reality: a system where sovereign African nations are compelled to deposit a large portion of their foreign currency reserves with the very nation that once colonized them, France. For years, these countries were required to deposit up to 85% of their reserves with the French Treasury, an arrangement born out of the CFA franc system. Although this figure has reportedly decreased to about 50 to 60% today, critics argue that the fundamental structure remains the same. The participating countries, mostly former French colonies, cannot freely access their own reserves. Instead, if they need their funds, they must request them in the form of a loan, subject to approval, and pay commercial interest rates on that loan. In effect, they borrow their own money while France invests those same funds in its economy. This mechanism has long been marketed as a way to ensure economic stability, given that the CFA franc is pegged to the euro. Supporters of the system argue that this provides inflation control and monetary discipline, giving these African countries financial credibility on the international stage. From this perspective, the arrangement prevents reckless monetary policy and protects currencies from wild fluctuations, which could trigger hyperinflation or massive devaluation. However, a growing number of economists, Pan-Africanists, and civil society leaders are challenging this narrative. They contend that the system is a relic of colonialism, an exploitative financial tool that continues to enrich France at Africa's expense. Many argue that it denies African countries full sovereignty over their economic futures, locking them into a cycle of debt, dependency, and underdevelopment. The numbers are stark. France is estimated to hold and invest over $500 billion annually from these African reserves. By investing this money into its own financial markets under French ownership, France reportedly generates massive returns. Figures as high as $300 billion per $14 billion invested have been cited by some commentators. This economic imbalance becomes even more disturbing when viewed against the realities on the ground in many of these African countries. Nations rich in gold, oil, cocoa, and other valuable resources struggle with widespread poverty, inadequate healthcare systems, crumbling infrastructure, and underfunded education sectors. Critics ask, how can countries so rich in natural and human resources remain so poor? The answer, they say, lies in the financial chains that continue to bind them. Some African leaders have begun to challenge this structure openly. Among them is Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a young and outspoken leader who has made sovereignty, both political and economic, a cornerstone of his agenda. Traoré has consistently used his platform to educate his people about what he describes as modern-day slavery, shedding light on international arrangements that continue to siphon wealth out of Africa. For many, Traoré's stance represents a breath of fresh air in a continent where leaders are often seen as complicit or silent in the face of foreign exploitation. But it is essential to acknowledge that this is a deeply complex issue. Not all economists agree that the CFA franc system is inherently flawed. Some argue that dismantling it without a solid alternative could lead to financial instability and potential economic chaos. Currency management is no small task, and without the institutional strength and infrastructure to back a sovereign monetary system, countries could face inflation, corruption, and further mismanagement. The euro peg, in this view, acts as a stabilizing anchor, helping these countries maintain discipline and attract international investment. Others counter that real development requires risk and autonomy. African nations, they argue, must reclaim full control over their financial systems, even if it means short-term instability. After all, no truly independent country should have to ask permission to access its own money. Pan-African economists emphasize that political sovereignty is hollow without economic independence. The ability to shape fiscal and monetary policy in response to local needs is a fundamental aspect of self-determination.
Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said those countries were expected to deposit 85% of their bank reserves back then with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And should those countries wish to request some of those monies, because remember they were only left with 15% of their reserves, then they would have to submit a financial statement for the country, and if approved, they could only access up to 20% of whatever they had deposited the year before as a loan at commercial interest rates. The only difference now is the 85% deposits have now been lowered down to maybe between 50 and 60%. But the countries are still forced and required to deposit their bank reserves with
the United Nations, which many expect to intervene in cases of systemic human rights abuse, has been notably silent on this matter. Critics point out that this silence reflects the deeply entrenched geopolitical interests that still govern global diplomacy. France, as a major global power and permanent member of the UN Security Council, retains significant influence. Calls for intervention or even public condemnation of the CFA franc arrangement have been largely ignored by international bodies, prompting frustration among African commentators and activists. Voices within the African diaspora are also rising, adding volume and visibility to this long-suppressed issue. Social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and independent news outlets have become key battlegrounds where activists, economists, and everyday Africans engage in passionate debate. Many have expressed outrage over what they see as blatant exploitation, calling for unity and collective action across the continent. For them, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are not just political figures, but symbols of a broader awakening. Yet this conversation cannot be reduced to black and white narratives. The reality is that many African nations still rely heavily on French aid, military support, and trade partnerships. France, for its part, has argued that it no longer enforces the CFA franc system by force, and that reforms are already underway. In recent years, France has agreed to relinquish some control over the foreign reserves of the West African Economic and Monetary Union, WAEMU, and discussions about replacing the CFA franc with a new regional currency, ECO, have surfaced. However, progress has been slow, and skeptics remain wary of token reforms that fail to dismantle the system's core. Meanwhile, the conversation continues to grow, fueled by a new generation of African thinkers, creators, and leaders. They are not only questioning inherited systems, but imagining bold alternatives. From blockchain technology to pan-African banking institutions, from regional currency unions to Afrocentric economic models, the solutions being proposed are as diverse as the continent itself. In the midst of this awakening, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands out, not because he claims to have all the answers, but because he has dared to ask difficult questions. He has insisted that his people deserve the truth, transparency, and agency. His critics may point to the challenges his administration faces, including domestic instability and economic pressures, but even they cannot deny the symbolic power of his defiance. By confronting systems of exploitation, Traoré has reignited a conversation that has simmered beneath the surface for too long. And while the road ahead is uncertain, what is clear is that the days of unquestioned loyalty to colonial-era agreements may be coming to an end. Africans are demanding a new deal, one rooted in fairness, respect, and sovereignty. Whether France and the broader international community are willing to meet Africa on equal footing remains to be seen. As this movement grows, one cannot help but reflect on the deeper implications. This is not merely about money or economics. It's about dignity. It's about the right of a people to determine their own future. It's about rewriting the story of a continent long defined by foreign interests. And it's about leaders, like Ibrahim Traoré, who are willing to challenge the status quo, no matter how deeply rooted it may be. To those following this discussion across the continent and in the diaspora, this is a moment of reckoning. The time has come to look inward, to build structures that serve African interests, and to stand firm in the face of historical injustices that continue to shape the present. Africa is not poor. It is being impoverished. And the first step toward healing that wound is to recognize it, name it, and resolve to end it. Together. Thank you to all our subscribers, supporters, and viewers of Voice of Africa. Your engagement is what keeps these vital stories alive. If you believe in this message, consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video. Subscribe to stay informed and empowered. The winds of change are blowing across Africa, and together, we are the